Hello and welcome to The Good Fight, which is an effort to bring together two people who disagree in an effort to find common ground. My name is Rob Farley. I will be your heard but not seen moderator. Our interlocutors for the day are Zack Beauchamp from Think Progress and Justin Logan from the Cato Institute. And we're animating around two questions today. The first is, how do we characterize the foreign policy orientation of the Obama administration? Interventionist, restrained, something in between. Hopefully we'll find one word. And our second topic for the day is going to be to discuss briefly Nick Kristof's recent op-ed discussing where exactly political science and other academics can contribute to the policy debate. So with that, whoever wants to start, just leap in. And how about Zach? How about you fire away, and then Justin will shoot back, presumably.
Sure. My basic view of the Obama administration is that they've straddled the line between the two fundamental competing impulses in the long run of American foreign policy, basically ideological thinking, which are a sort of liberal universalism that places a lot of emphasis on creating global structures that are designed to promote human rights and human welfare internationally, and a realism that focuses principally on America's strategic position. And I think the Obama administration has not been able to chart a clear course between these two positions. I think that it depends on issue to issue what judgment they're going to make about which type of reasoning to employ or which school to broadly align itself with. So I think oftentimes it ends up looking to people who are on the opposite side of that ideological divide as if Obama is completely of the other school because it's easier to emphasize the negative side, when in reality it's sort of I don't want to say confused, but that's pretty close, a muddle. I would say a muddle between those two things.
Right. So my take on it was a little bit different. Like all good political debates, this started with a Twitter feud over a piece by David Reef in the National Interest, alleging, I thought interestingly and mostly persuasively, that there was a lot of continuity between the grand strategy of Bush the Younger to the Obama grand strategy. And so I sort of promoted this piece and said this was a good piece and got some pushback. One of the pushers back was Zack. And so just in preparing for this, I drew up a little litany of non-interventionist, realist grievances with the administration's foreign policy. And so maybe if I just sort of rattle them off really quickly, not a 5-minute soliloquy, but, the president came into office talking about ending the mindset that got the country to go to war in Iraq. He gave a speech at the National Defense University last year, emphasizing that we need to not be on what he called, quote, a permanent wartime footing. And yet, at the same time, I think the substance of his foreign policies has been quite interventionist, and this was maybe one of the controversial points that I tried to make on Twitter. If we remove the Iraq War, which was the signal foreign policy achievement, such as it was of the Bush administration, I think you can draw a pretty clear line from even the grand strategy of President Clinton through the younger Bush through Obama. So President...
Yeah, but I have a problem. Like, I think we should probably stop right there, because this was one of the main points of the argument that we had on Twitter, which is how can you, as you just said, take the main accomplishment, signal enterprise of the Bush administration and say, other than their, it's basically a, other than that, how is the play, Mrs. Lincoln type situation. Right. In the argument that you're trying to make.
What we're doing if we do that is we're emphasizing sort of variation on the dependent variable, right? So Iraq was the big thing that changed, but I think there were many more important things, right or wrong, that are comprised in American grand strategy. U.S. Policy toward China, for instance, is much more important than the Iraq War, and I think there's been a lot of continuity there. I think there's been a lot of continuity in terms of trying to infantilize America's allies and to keep them as security clients of various American alliance commitments. And I think that relations with major powers are more important than the various weak states that the United States decides to beat up on. I want to be clear, I thought that the Iraq War was a disaster. I said so beforehand. Very few people in town said so beforehand. But I think that just because we're sort of chugging along and there's not that much interesting happening in 2004 or in 2009 on U.S.-China policy, I think it's important when we talk about grand strategy that we don't sort of go down these rabbit holes of wild American crusades.
Well, I mean, there's two ways of interpreting what you just said. I would start with the former, which is like that there's been a great deal of continuity in large parts of American foreign policy. And I think that that's broadly been true going back through the Cold War. Right, there actually, despite the individual policy differences between Cold War presidents, there wasn't that deep a disagreement about the sorts of tools that we needed to use to go after the Soviets, and that in fact aggressive action against the Soviet Union was desirable and important. And as a consequence, that led to a broad global alliance system, which the United States stuck itself in with the same sorts of countries that we're still allied with today. And so then you could say, if you take that broad a view, that there's been literally no change in American foreign policy since the end of the Cold War. But I think that that's clearly wrong. I think it is wrong and misses lots of very important differences. For example, the Iraq War is obviously the biggest example, but there's all sorts of different ones that you could bring up. George H.W. Bush's views on humanitarian intervention, for example, were very different than Clinton's and Barack Obama's, and likewise, George W. Bush, while an interventionist, may not have been a humanitarian interventionist. These doctrines and how they get used and how they get deployed by different presidents matter a great deal to the real impact of American foreign policy on people's lives, Americans and non-Americans. And so just to say, well, because certain baseline things are the same, like who we're allies with in Asia, is to, I think, miss very, very important differences between different presidents and different strains in American ideological thinking.
Let me try to distinguish between American foreign policy and American grand strategy. When I'm talking about grand strategy, which is a sort of conceited, ridiculous term, I'll concede, it's the sort of high politics of American foreign policy. It's to use Barry Posen's rhetoric, the theory by which a country's foreign policy elite produces security for itself. So it's pitched both at a higher level of abstraction and a higher level of sort of statesmanship than various humanitarian interventions or other enterprises. And I would just point out that, it's certainly true that the elder Bush had some different views on American foreign policy than did President Clinton, but it was the elder Bush, after all, who got the country into Somalia, a country with no plausible strategic value, and then obviously that albatross hung around Clinton's neck. So I think even on the sort of lower politics of American foreign policy, there's been a lot of continuity, and I certainly concede the point. Zach's quite right that at least since the late 1950s, there really hasn't been a dissident voice in the American mainstream on grand strategy. There was obviously a left-wing revulsion at the Vietnam War, which was important, but I think that there has been this sort of groupthink, and I think that to exempt President Obama, and more specifically his sort of higher-level advisors, are very much part and parcel of the sort of establishmentarian, the liberal interventionist wing of the sort of American grand strategic mainstream, with hawkish nationalists and neoconservatives comprising the other side of that. And I think that to overdraw distinctions is to really miss what's going on in American grand strategy.
If I can interject briefly, I was one of the people who was pushing back with respect to the David Reef article. Reef does cite several things which I think you might characterize as the flotsam and jetsam of foreign policy, which in this case would be Libya, would be the abortive effort to go to war in Syria, and so forth. And so it seemed to me from the Reef article that he was making a sort of a more specific argument about similarity between the Obama administration and at least the second Bush administration than what you're implying here.
Right. So I think both of those are possible. I think it's possible to do a sort of ivory tower grand strategic comparison and to draw a lot of continuity from at least the end of the Cold War through 2014 in terms of American grand strategy. And what Reif was trying to do was to say that there's actually a lot of continuity. Again, controversially, we can talk about this, stipulating out Iraq for a moment, between President Bush's war on terror policies and President Obama's war on terror policies. If you look at the ridiculous surge in Afghanistan, that was very costly, it cost American lives for no strategic objective, and that in fact the president himself, if we're to believe Secretary Gates, didn't believe in, but rather for some fear of the generals, fear of Republicans, or not really wanting to spend political capital to end that war, he persisted in and indeed prolonged. The president has claimed near plenary authority to murder an American citizen on the justification that he's consulted with his advisors about it, without any judicial review of any import, or certainly any legislative impact. And, I think the list goes on. Even in these sort of Arab world war on terror policies, there was the sort of silly campaign about Libya that was led that the intervention there headed off the slaughter of 100,000 civilians in Benghazi, which if you read the Gaddafi speech, maybe he was lying when he said that if people who even had been fighting the regime in Benghazi, if they laid down their arms, they would be spared.
Justin, could you restate that? I think you clicked out for a second.
Yeah, you cut out.
Restate the Libya piece or restate the...
Yeah, the Libya piece. The Libya piece.
Yeah. So I think that the administration played hard and fast with the Libya intervention. I think that the administration officials constantly went on TV and said that the intervention averted the slaughter of up to 100,000 civilians, despite the fact that there was very little evidence that that was what Gaddafi had planned.
Yeah. That's flatly wrong. I mean, Gaddafi had telegraphed his indication to slaughter people in the streets, and I know the semantic distinction you're about to draw in his statements, where it sounds like he was targeting rebels, but the behavior of his troops in the run-up to the attack on Benghazi was consistent with what we've seen in cases of mass slaughter in cities before, as in fact several experts on humanitarian intervention and genocide argued right up to and directly after the decision to intervene. Right? This wasn't the administration just claiming things, powers, and an objective based on phantasms in the way that you implicitly say that this is a point of continuity because Bush made up the justification about WMDs to go to war in Iraq. This is a very different thing and a very more grounded thing. And I think it gets to, even on the level of grand strategy, the abstract sort of level you want to get to, the important differences between Obama and Bush. Namely that one core component of Bush's grand strategy, if you look at the 2002 national strategy document particularly, right, there was a massive revision to American foreign policy in the past, was the idea of preemptive regime change as a way of, one, non-proliferation, controlling weapons, and two, spreading democracy, and three, creating just more broadly a pro-American world. The idea of rolling back dictators, of preemptive regime change, as a common, using invasions, sorry, not the CIA, which was a Cold War thing. Using invasions was a real transformation, an aggressive transformation of American foreign policy thought. And that is, on any plausible understanding of what grand strategy is,
Mm-hmm.
The broad sweep of how a country uses its powers, that's a difference in grand strategic doctrine. And the Libya intervention was very, very different than the kind of mass invasions that the Bush administration's strategy called for early in 2002.
Sure. Just to take those points in turn, I think that the administration absolutely played fast and loose with the evidence, despite what various humanitarian experts say. If you look at the Gaddafi regimes, and see, this is the dilemma of this sort of a debate, is that I will now be the Gaddafi apologist, and Zack will be the liberal, and that's not his fault, right? That's just the way that these debates get read. So I want to be clear.
Justin, how many Libyans have to die
that's right.
before you're willing to do something?
But that's part of the problem here, right? Is that that's a very good point, and let me sort of get off the rails and get on to that point. What happens in these discussions is that presidential administrations that want to do things for humanitarian purposes rarely leave the argument at the humanitarian level. They bring in all sorts of self-interested rationales for why this needs to be done. So if you listen to Secretary Gates, we needed to bomb Libya to save NATO, right? This was really about the American position in Europe. So I think if we had debates about humanitarian interventions where the principles stipulated, this isn't about us, this isn't about our interests, this isn't about the well-being of you and your ability to send your children to school in safety. We just have a lot of material power and we want to use it on behalf of a third party because we think that they deserve it and they're being threatened wrongly by a regime. We would have a much more thoroughgoing and fair debate on these issues. But to get back to Zack's arguments about Gaddafi's behavior in the lead-up to what would have been some sort of denouement in Benghazi, he's just wrong about that. If you look at the conduct of Gaddafi's soldiers in Misrata, for example, which immediately preceded what would have gone down in Benghazi, there was a civil war going on. People were being killed. Innocent people were dying. But there's absolutely no evidence from what Gaddafi said in the speeches, which could have been deceitful, could have been lies, but ought not to be used in making the converse point that he in fact did intend to slaughter civilians willy-nilly in Benghazi, which is what the Obama administration said he said. His military conduct in Misrata indicated that he did not slaughter civilians indiscriminately. So counterfactuals are difficult. This is very important. But if we're going to have a war, or as the Obama administration deceitfully phrased it, a kinetic military action, that therefore not being a war wouldn't require any congressional involvement, we ought to we can't have wars on the basis of opposition to war needing to prove a counterfactual, right? Unless you can prove that Gaddafi won't do X, slaughter 100,000 civilians in Benghazi, we're going to have the war just the same.
Well, this is the problem with any public policy argument, though, is you can always say, in the counterfactual case, like X, Y, and Z things wouldn't have happened that you guys predicated your action on. Therefore, we're going to do this thing. You could say, take some look back at health policy before the implementation of Obamacare and say, look at all of these things that I think, based on my read of the data, would have happened, which suggested that we didn't need to implement Affordable Care Act provisions after all. Right? You can make those arguments no matter what, and they're particularly egregious in the cases of humanitarian intervention, because I can respond to each of your arguments and say, for example, Misrata wasn't the same thing as Benghazi, which was the ideological heart of the insurgency, and Gaddafi, in his speeches, was clearly planning to make an example out of it and was massing troops in situations where it's very hard to make determinations between civilian centers and military centers in street-to-street fighting, and the guy clearly had no compunction about slaughtering his own civilians based on his, long time in power. Now, I can make those arguments, and you will almost certainly have responses, but we can't actually resolve that debate. What the president had to do in this past case, and I think he made the right call on this one, is say, look, something terrible might be about to happen. What do I think the probability of it happening is? And do I have to take action about that thing before it occurs? Now, to get back to the main point, that's a very, very different kind of calculation in a lot of ways, because it's based on a very immediate risk of harm to civilians, than the sort of thing the Bush administration was doing in its long-range, big, grand strategic type approach to counterterrorism and more broadly authoritarianism in the Middle East. They're just very, very dissimilar policies.
At the risk of getting bogged down indefinitely in Libya, to get rid of that risk, let me ask a broader question about sort of your view of the Obama administration's grand strategy and its foreign policy that may illuminate our disagreement. Do you think that the administration has gotten enough, too much, or too little criticism from, let's say, the left on its foreign, security, and civil liberties policies?
Interesting question. I think it depends on what you mean by the left. I think that from certain left-wing activists and publications have been very admirable in criticizing the president in areas that I think that he was behind on. For example, I've written this several times, have some questions about NSA spying and the legitimacy of the use of the NSA under the Obama administration. And some of their security policies they've been a little slow on Guantanamo. Sometimes it's hard to fault them for that based on congressional objections, but these are the kinds of objections I think they have been getting, and somewhat deservedly so, from people on the left. Yeah. I think that they also deserve mixed reviews for their handling of the run-up to the near intervention in Syria. And I would say, arguably, they were about to come in for a fair amount of criticism had they launched the strikes. It seemed like the left was largely critical of the chemical weapons strikes anyway.
I agree with that on Syria a lot. So I guess the reason I ask that question is because, and maybe this will segue into the discussion of the Nick Kristof piece in political science and the little corner of political science that I know reasonably well. There is, baked into the U.S. foreign policy, U.S. grand strategy cake, an orientation, if you can have an orientation baked into a cake, toward intervention, right? There's what, I think it was Ari Berman a long time ago called the strategic class, right? The Richard Holbrooke, Anne-Marie Slaughter, what I, to my sort of libertarian realist orientation, would call interventionists, or to use John Mearsheimer's phrase, liberal imperialists. They are the democratic foreign policy establishment, just as the neoconservatives are the Republican foreign policy establishment. So the reason I ask about criticism from the left is that, in general, when you have discussions about foreign policy inside the government, you have foreign policy principals in the room. They don't invite Amy Goodman or whomever else to come in and discuss these things. So there's so much of a prejudice toward the wielding of American power, doing things in the world. And I think one of the things that Reef brought up that I hadn't really thought about before was this Victoria Nuland call that got, a lot of notoriety because of her vulgarity in the thing. But the idea that an American State Department official is saying this person should be part of the Ukrainian government and this other person should not be a part of the Ukrainian government, that is a striking sort of discussion to have without an apparent whiff of self-awareness. We're picking winners and losers in a political dispute in a third. I mean that's sort of illustrative from my point of view about the mindset of the American foreign policy establishment.
Can I interject just so very briefly here, and I guess make 2 points, and I guess pose 2 questions to Justin, but I think these also may be interesting. I guess from one point of view, I'm looking at your argument, Justin, and I'm seeing there is much I can agree with. However, by the frame in which you are making distinctions between U.S. presidents, and I think Zack sort of implied this before, there is no distinction between any U.S. presidents during the Cold War, right? And if we have a metric that is unable to distinguish between the last 10 American presidents, this is not a useful metric for evaluating the foreign policy orientations of American presidents, right? If it always reads interventionist, then it's not entirely helpful. So at least consider that. And second, and I think this may be where we sort of capture some of the reasons people think there might be a distinction, there is a different enthusiasm level between the Obama and the Bush administration with regard to intervention, right? And sort of the Syria example really brings this out, where it was palpably obvious that even if the strikes were carried out, the administration was not enthusiastic about them in the same way that the Bush administration had been enthusiastic about even invasions that it did not carry out during the previous 8 years. So I guess just do either of those matter at all?
Yeah, so I think they both matter. So as to the first point, if we can't differentiate between the last 10 American presidents in terms of their overall grand strategic orientation, is there something screwed up with the tool that we're using to evaluate them? Maybe, although I don't see any a priori reason why it might not be possible that a great empire would have a more or less continuous grand strategy over half a century or so. So I think that's a good question to ask, but I don't think it's sort of self-dispositive in the sense of saying it's obviously true that there's great difference between John F. Kennedy, Ronald Reagan, and Barack Obama. So therefore, if you lump them into the same general category, something's wrong with the lumping machine. I think that's a good point to raise, although, I don't think it necessarily knocks down the argument that American grand strategy has been more or less continuous. And as to the enthusiasm level, I think that's a sort of more supple, nuanced criticism, which is to say, look, so neither one of you guys has pushed back hard on my sort of squirming about Iraq, right? Clearly, 2002, 2003 was a crazy time in American foreign policy in the context of what you're calling enthusiasm level. There was a lot of enthusiasm in 2002, 2003, and that sort of quantitative difference created a qualitative difference, right? So I'll just sort of self-indict on that point in the sense that, yes, you do have to talk about Iraq. Something crazy happened there, although I don't think that encompassed the entire Bush administration's grand strategy. And on the Syria thing, it's interesting because I was surprised. I was wrong about the entire way that sort of few months went. I thought that the administration was going to go to Congress immediately, and I thought that Congress was going to give, 300 probably votes in favor of the policy, and we would be off to the races. So that sort of indicates that, yes, my idea that we're always interventionists sometimes steers me astray.
Right, and I think that's an important point to pick up on, because it relates to something I wanted to say earlier about your taxonomy of who matters in American foreign policy. And I think you're right to say that major parties, by and large, are largely some sort of liberal interventionist and neoconservative right now. However, historically, that hasn't been true about the Republican Party. Before Ronald Reagan, Republicans were, by and large, some kind of, and I don't, there's no good term for this, but the best one I've thought of is establishment realists. They're people who believe in the broad architecture of American foreign policy that we've been talking about, allies with Europe, basing in East Asia, so on and so forth. Right? They all accept all of that. In the Cold War, it was all about fighting the Soviets. But these folks aren't humanitarian interventionists. They're people who think very clearly in terms of American national interests and in terms of what we can do to advance that and harm our enemies or whatever. The prototypical examples of these people are probably, in different ways, George Kennan and Henry Kissinger. And this sort of establishment realism isn't intrinsically interventionist in the sense that it doesn't think we have a crusading obligation to go help other people. I think really only neoconservatives think that now. There are oftentimes people who want to put the brakes on interventions, and you see to a certain degree a lot of that in Obama's cabinet, right? Which is why he's not in any meaningful sense a pure liberal. And you see that in some Republican circles still today. And while increasingly small, and you're increasingly seeing them replaced by more hardline non-interventionists like Justin Amash. But that's a really, really important constraining force in American foreign policy, and why I think it's quite wrong to say that there's been an unbroken train of interventionism, of sort of principled interventionism in American foreign policy.
I partly agree and partly disagree. I don't think it's I forget the rhetoric you used, but strong constraint or anything like that. I think it's not a strong constraint, because I think that you're quite right that the analytical frame of a Henry Kissinger or a George Kennan is very much raison d'etat. It's about interests. It's about hosing your enemies terribly. But by and large, almost to a person, and George Kennan here, whose book, Diaries, I have over my shoulder, was a great exception to this. They're threat inflators, right? All of these people have this very sort of constrained, narrow, some people might say pinched view of the national interest and how it should animate American intervention overseas. But they also, by and large, in practice, tend to be threat inflators, great big threat inflators. There's a great line from a John Mueller piece that's underappreciated, where he quotes the former head of the CIA, James Woolsey, as saying at the end of the Cold War, we had slain the great dragon, but now fallen into a nest of vipers. The vipers were just as dangerous as the dragon. And so as America has sort of surmounted actual foreign threats, big foreign threats to America's way of life that these sorts of Kennanites and Kissingerians worried about, what we did is inflate other threats, right? So now we have nuclear proliferation, or we have uncertainty is the great threat that Dempsey and other people talk about. It's not so neat as the Cold War was, even though during the Cold War nobody thought that the Cold War was neat. And we mucked around in South Asia and Central Asia and Africa. So I think it's right that analytically those people tend to be anti-interventionist, but the ones who get ahead in Washington also tend to be threat inflators, which then brings into the realm of national interest and high politics, et cetera, a whole bunch of things that, to my mind, be they right or wrong, are frivolous and not related to the national interest. And so that gets into maybe the Kristof piece, because realists in the academy, you're quite right, tend to be anti-interventionist, and if they had any power to speak of, which they don't, they would be a brake on American interventionism overseas. But people who call themselves realists in Washington aren't, I think, really realists and are just threat inflators and interventionists.
I suppose before we pass
Sorry,
on,
Rob.
I was just going to say that before we pass on to Kristof, Zach, if you wanted to respond to anything that Justin just said, just so we could close that part and then move on.
Yeah, I did. I think it is a very, to use one of your words, pinched view of realism to say that the only kind of realist that could exist, that's really the one true realist in the same sense of the one true Scotsman fallacy, right, is the one who's a principled, in all cases, non-interventionist.
No, I want to be clear, that's not what I'm saying.
I think that lots of, and I think that lots of realists have, that have very different interpretations of what their doctrines would imply with respect to other things. Now, I also want to pick up on the thread about threat inflation, because here I think we can agree wholeheartedly that there are lots of things that are not nearly as big threats as some people want to say that they are, that are portrayed as such in Washington consistently and routinely. And I think someone with my views and someone with your views can very well agree that that's terrible, and we should not do that. Now, I think that the upshot of not doing that is that we should spend less effort chasing down phantom threats and more money devoted to a variety of different projects to enhance human welfare globally, whereas you might think that we should, stop spending that money altogether or devote it to more specifically homeland-related projects. And that's an argument to have. So I think that that's, though, independent of the question of threat inflation as a source of interventionism, because I think that that is a mainstream foreign policy plague that I'm not sure what the cause is of. And I certainly don't think it's the predominance of, say, humanitarian interventionism or liberal institutionalism as doctrines in Washington. And I don't think that it's establishment realism either on the doctrinal level. It's something else about the political culture of American foreign policy that causes that.
I think the existence of a massive military and diplomatic establishment causes us to create threat inflation, right? I think people need something to do. If this massive millions of people infrastructure of Beltway bandits, people who work at the Defense Department, AID hangers-on, I would put in this category as well, people who are milking the American national security teat for their livelihood, need there to be threats. If everyone had a sort of Mike Kazenko, Michael Cohen view that we've reached sort of Shangri-La in terms of realist national security. Nobody's going to swim over here and chew off a part of Florida. There's not going to be an Al-Qaeda beachhead in Olympia. These things, we've just sort of gotten beyond really important proximate threats. The rationale from that for the entire American national security establishment would be under threat. And bureaucracies tend not to self-evaluate very well.
I mean, sorry, Justin, are you still there?
Hello?
Justin?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay.
So I would say yes and no on that point, right? In part because some of the reasons that have made, in the Zenko Cohen article that you reference, America a much safer place are, to a certain degree, the things that those people do. Now, you and I probably disagree about this, but I think that the American presence in East Asia is immensely stabilizing, and there's very, very good evidence that that's true. And, that's a big part of what the American defense and foreign policy establishment does. I think that the spread of a bunch of relatively stable countries, or more stable democracies than there used to be, has also made the world safer. And some of the improvements in human welfare that have made democratic transition and stability easier have been because of American aid projects. Now, not that much. That's a small percentage of it. I think that the East Asia point's more important here. But I think that there are legitimate arguments for the existence of a lot of these institutions, independent of just threat inflation, though I do agree that defense contractors and such, and the imperative to, say, build ridiculous airplanes that we don't need, which is something I know Rob would like to talk about a lot, is unnecessary. And that those people, the people that are involved in that, do contribute to threat inflation, but I don't think they're just it. I think it also has a lot to do with politics, just politics in general in American political culture, and that you have an incentive, given the way that the political structure works, to say that there's a problem and we're going to fix it, rather than, even in the foreign realm, rather than to say there's no problem, everything's fine, don't worry about anything. That's just, I think in a lot of cases, at least in the United States, not a winning political strategy.
All right, I think actually this sounds like a perfect time to segue into the question here of Nick Kristof, who has a penchant for saving people. Just to explain briefly, the eruption over Nick Kristof happened when Nick Kristof said this weekend that political scientists in particular, but also academics, need to be more involved in the public sphere, and that the structure of academia sort of militates against, right? There's no tenure benefit for becoming publicly involved, that the university system doesn't support public involvement. And he was responded to by effectively every single political scientist and usually in very hostile ways, who is involved in any fashion in the public sphere. And now, so Justin, you are a political scientist, right? Is that correct?
I'm just a guy with a master's degree, so I'm a journeyman, I guess, or something. I don't know.
All right. Well, how about you two outsiders? Yes. Comment on this debate, which I, as a political scientist, obviously know a great deal about, but I'm just going to refrain.
Yeah, you're the subject, you're the object, and we'll analyze you.
Exactly.
So, right,
I will feel curiously like American foreign policy, right, where you guys debate my future.
That's right. So, the Kristof piece caused this great outcry among a bunch of political scientists who are doing policy-relevant research. And so I, as a self-hating Washingtonian and a self-hating think tanker, think that for all the pathologies of academia, which are many, they are too frequently blamed for too much of the gap, which is frequently the formulation used in international relations and in foreign policy, between policymakers and the academy, right? So it's true that the academy has a sort of methods for methods' sake fetish. It's true that many people on tenure committees and elsewhere look askance and think it's bad for professors to publish in foreign affairs or foreign policy or journals like that. So all of those things are true. But I think that academics, Joe Nye had a piece in the Washington Post, Mike Dash and Paul Avey have a piece in ISQ, really pointing the blame at themselves. And not themselves, rather, but the academy more generally. And I think that the academy has gotten a disproportionately large share of the blame, and my cohort here in Washington, both in government, which is not really my cohort, but in think tanks as well, haven't gotten nearly so much of the blame. And I think there's a ton of policy-relevant research being done in the academy that is ignored in Washington because it does not tell principals in Washington what they want to hear. There's a ton of work on nuclear proliferation. Jock Hyman's, who's one of the leading academic experts on nuclear proliferation, had a piece in the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists saying if this round of Iran negotiations goes off the rails, don't worry, because there are lots of reasons to believe that Iran will have other impediments to their acquisition of a bomb, etc., etc. It's extremely solid research, it's extremely policy relevant, and it is completely ignored in Washington because it does not comport with the groupthink that characterizes American foreign policy. So I think there's been too much blame for the academy. You know, the problem is sort of coefficients and Greek letters, and where they're not Greek letters and not coefficients, people in Washington would listen to academics. I don't think that's true. And I think there's been an underappreciation of the fact that arrogant policymakers think they know what's right, and they're willing to take advice on how to do what they think is right, but they don't cast about for expert opinion on what is right to prefer in the first place. So I think that these self-hating academics really need to get to town more often to figure out how pathological things are here.
Yeah, let me join the chorus of self-hatred for a little bit and blame my profession, which is that I think that the foreign policy journalistic establishment has done a very, very poor job at taking academic research that could be of real public policy value. As Justin suggested, Jacques Hyman's work on Iran has been great. There's all sorts of other policy-relevant research that you could get into. For example, in foreign aid, you could talk about research that shows that direct cash transfers to the poor have done an immense job in making people's lives better in trial runs, and that might be a good blueprint to start, say, a trial USAID expansion in that particular area. That sort of thing comes up relatively rarely and comparatively rarely to the economic case. So economists and economic research comes up all the time in Washington debates. And I don't know why this isn't true in foreign policy, but I have to think that some of the blame is that people who do what I do, which is writing about foreign policy for the public for a living, haven't done as good a job as the people who write about economic policy at taking research and translating it into a way that's publicly accessible and useful and explaining why people should care about it and why it's of importance to policymakers. And it's part of it is the bias, I think, towards thinking that economics is something that's readily quantifiable, whereas foreign policy isn't. It's an art. It's something that you just sort of know because of experience. You have to have been in the field to get it. Whereas foreign policy and understanding how the world works is amenable to qualitative research that's done in archives and quantitative research using data inputs. Those things are both really, really helpful to understanding the world and arguably better at it than going out in a random place and sitting there for 2 weeks and writing what you saw. I'm not sure that's epistemically a great way to learn things.
I completely co-sign on the idea that the number of countries you've visited is illustrative of your knowledge of international politics. I visited a few countries, so maybe this is self-interested that I haven't visited 100 countries, but I think that's totally right, and I think that part of the reason that the foreign policy establishment is able to get away with ignoring a lot of the social scientific research about international politics and foreign policy is precisely because the United States is so secure, right? So I agree, and I don't want to get into my libertarian heterodoxies about economic policy, but there are wild and crazy economic ideas in Washington on right and left, I think, so to be ecumenical about it. But the reason so few of those get instituted, I think, I could be wrong about this, is because fear of reprisal, right? If we just decided, these laws of supply and demand are really bullshit, so let's just strike off in a new way and see what happens. There would be real, pretty immediate feedback when the economy went into a ditch that made 2008 look like Shangri-La. So, whereas in foreign policy, I think it's the case that we are so profoundly secure. The policymakers can screw up over and over again without consequences. So you'd have to do in Iraq, right? And even if you look at who really paid the consequences for Iraq, well, people sort of hate George W. Bush, although not as much as you might think today. But that's really it, right? Nobody was really ridden out of town on a rail. Nobody really paid proximate, dear consequences for that complete, I won't be vulgar, but nightmare of a policy. So I think that policymakers, and I have an article that have been working on with a colleague on this, are inclined to take operational advice from academics. So you bring in Steve Biddle to tell you how to fight the Afghan war, not whether you should fight the Afghan war. And there's a great line from Bernard Brody in his book War and Politics that says really the only sine qua non of being an outside consultant to the government on a particular policy is agreeing with the policy itself, right? You could say it should go in this direction or that different direction. But if you say this policy is sort of just screwed up conceptually and doesn't comport with the research that exists on this problem, you're out of here. And that's understandable, right? It makes sense that people who believe in a policy don't want to bring skunks to the garden party. But operational research, and if you look at a thing like Minerva in foreign policy, they're not bringing in a bunch of people to rend their garments about grand strategy and talk about the hub and spokes alliance system in Asia. It's these sort of more mid-tier operational level questions, mid-range theorists. And so that's what we get in IR, and I think that's a problem because I think American grand strategy itself is open to a lot of interrogation and a lot of scrutiny.
Yeah, I think also it's not quite just accountability, right? Because the amount of accountability for the financial crisis, I think we can all agree, is laughable. And I also think that that's another illustrative example because that was a total failure of economic policymaking, right? A variety of different things had to go wrong, terribly wrong, for the financial crisis to happen in the way that it did. And they did, all of them, despite some of them being foreseen by certain people. And you could say, now we've done some things to correct that, and that's true, and I won't make the cheap partisan point about how that happened. But I don't think that it was nearly the kind of wholesale reckoning, arguably, that you saw about the Bush administration's preemption policies after the Iraq War. Now, the idea, if anyone proposed taking out a government, like invading a government and toppling it, because it might pose a threat to the United States at one point in the future, you'd be laughed out of the policy debate. Whereas, if somebody's like, well, we think the financial markets are self-regulating and can handle themselves, well, Republicans on the Hill say that every day.
Right. Yeah.
And, in fact, plenty of people continue to argue that.
I don't know. I mean, I think you have to go further than you think to get written out of polite company in the American foreign policy debate. So I say that as somebody who long ago was written out of polite company in the American foreign policy debate. But, it's the case that, without naming names, certain neoconservative think tanks that have a lot of egg on their face still get invited to White House briefings on national security, whereas somebody like Cato Institute Justin Logan, who's been written out of polite company, doesn't. So I think there are a lot of these people who you think, have been adequately dressed down for their cockamamie ideas about how to run a foreign policy are still around, still have very nice sinecures at think tanks and still get published in, let's say, the most widely circulated op-ed page in the country, stipulating that it has some oddities about it. So, and just maybe as a coda to this thing about the financial crisis, I agree. I mean, I think that's a good point, counterpoint to my idea that in economic policy there's more fear of reprisal. And I was at the University of Chicago when the financial crisis was in full swing, and I have to say that there was a lot of schadenfreude in the political science department, which had been long looked down on as unscientific, sort of poetry clique by the people at the Booth School, who, after all, had fancy mathematical models and had nailed down scientifically the way that markets work. Because not only was it absolute chaos, chickens running around with their heads cut off, trying to figure out what to do, there was absolutely no consensus what had happened to financial markets. There were these incredibly drawn-out, months-long, years-long debates about precisely what happened. So I think as a sort of coda to this, there's certainly a lot of complexity in economics. So that problematizes the idea that economic ideas, right? So Janet Yellen, I think, is more conversant in discussions in peer-reviewed economics journals than is John Kerry conversant in peer-reviewed articles in international relations. So that is sort of, I think, the nature of the problem that my little corner of political science faces, and I have all sorts of ideas about why that might be, but I'm pretty sure that it's true.
Well, I think that's definitely right. I think it's a really strong point. And it gets back to what we were talking about a little bit earlier about the bias towards it's an epistemological bias, I think, towards experience as a way of learning things in the foreign policy realm that you don't have in the economic realm, because what does that mean? Does it mean you have to run a major bank? For whatever reason, people don't think that running a major bank is the same type of qualification to do long-range policymaking as, say, being a general, like an upper-level general in the army, is to be Secretary of Defense. That is, or a senator, right? People have the sense that economic governance is technical, that it's really a branch of academia as applied to government. Whereas foreign policy activity is something else entirely. It's a thing you learn by being part of. And that's wrong, I think. Maybe arguably in both counts, but
yeah, no, I think
certainly in the latter.
We've found agreement.
Yep.
We found common ground. Well, I mean, gentlemen, we've been going here for close to an hour, and I think that does anybody have anything else to say before we move along?
No.
Always, but not right now.
Well, Justin, thank you. Zach, thank you. And viewers of Blogging Heads and listeners of Blogging Heads, thank you as well. And we hope to continue this particular form of Blogging Heads, which is called The Good Fight. And thank you very much, and let us know what you think.